Greetings, Vokaroos. It's Haley, and today we'll be continuing on from last week's discussion about the basic fundamentals of chess, and we're going to start to be discussing the actual strategy that you can use in the beginning of a chess game to get a better position and hopefully win. That's right. We are getting into the good stuff. We're not talking about any boring knight moves or anything. We're going to talk about actual game strategy. So without further ado, let's quit the blabbering and head on in. All right. So I'm sure you remember that this is the chessboard. I mean, that's right. We're back. We're back so soon. But how do you actually use this to play a good game of chess? It's really not that easy of a question to answer, but I will do my best to begin to answer it today. So, the first thing I think I should tell you is that a game of chess is generally split up into 3 phases. The first phase is the opening. It's when players just move their pieces out and start the game. Then we have the middle game, which is like the middle of the game where like tactics and strategy start happening. You probably don't know what that means. I'll teach you in future videos. Don't worry about it. And then you have the end game, when all of the pieces, pretty much, when most of the pieces have been traded, and it's just left with a pretty simple position, and then the game ends normally. But the barriers between the phases that I just described are kind of poorly defined. There's like some principles that you can follow to like separate the game into these phases, but it's not really too important to do that. But for the sake of simplicity, I'll be going over the opening today, and then maybe some of the stuff can also apply in the early middle game. We'll be discussing more middle game tactics, middle game strategy and tactics next video, and then I'll talk about the end game in a future video. So you probably know that there are a lot, and I mean a lot of openings in the game of chess. For example, you have let me just develop a piece like this. You have the Ruy Lopez, like this. You have the Italian, which is moving your bishop to a different square. You have the Petrov's defense. You have the Philidor defense. You have the Sicilian defense, the Caro-Kann defense, and that's just when white does this. There is an ocean of possibilities in chess, and it's intimidating to a lot of people. That's what drives a lot of people away, is the memorization of all of these openings. Because not only do you have to remember what characterizes each opening, like what pawn moves and knight moves and stuff characterize the opening, you need to memorize certain lines of that opening with like all of these different variations and complexities, and that drives a lot of people off. And I understand that, and I empathize with that. So in this video, I won't be delving into any of those openings. I'll just be explaining some basic principles that you can follow that will get you through the opening phase and into the middle game, where it's less about memorization and more about pattern recognition and practice. Yeah, in future videos, I will be giving you some book openings and going in depth and teaching you the points and strategies that will derive from those openings, but that's not for this video. Instead, in this video, I will begin by teaching you the principles. I've done a lot of talk before this, so let's start actually learning the principles. So the first principle I want to teach you, and this is extremely important, this is probably, in my opinion, the most important principle, is that you need to take control of the center of the board. Now, what do I mean by the center? It's actually very specific. I mean these 4 squares right here. That is the center of the board. And the reason you want to take control of the center is because your pieces are most active. They can do the most things in the center. They see the most squares. Remember last week we talked about what pieces can see. From the center, your pieces have a lot of scope and power over the enemy. So let's say, for example, that white begins with the pawn to e4. And let's say black doesn't do e5, like I showed you as part of like the Ruy Lopez in Italian. Let's say black like does this. Like this is a suboptimal move because it's not controlling the center. And then white will put another pawn in the center, and then like black will do this, and then you can like bring a knight out, controlling center space. Let's say black does the same exact thing. Like notice the engine eval. Like this is the engine eval is just basically like the computer rating the position, how good it is for each player. And the bar going up past the middle here for white states that it's much better for white. Because white has two pawns in the center that are controlling all of these squares in the center of the board. Like the pawns are controlling all those squares. The knights are controlling these squares. The knights are defending the pawns. The queen is defending this pawn. And what has black done? Black's moved two pawns and then moved the rooks. Like, what are these rooks even doing? These knights have potential. They can jump into the center and create threats. If black happens to develop a knight, for example, you can even attack it with this pawn because you take center space. And look, the computer evaluation goes up even more because of the center space that you have. Like, black can't even do this. Black has trouble doing this because the knight will actually get stuck on the side of the board. Like, it can't go back, and it can't go here. You can't take this without losing it. So this just is a demonstration of how powerful it is to hold the center of the board when your opponent doesn't. Because if you get a stranglehold on the center of the board, your opponent will have a very hard time marshaling their forces without you just shoving them around with like pawn pushes like I just showed you. And I also think a principle that you can't talk about without talking about taking the center is that the second principle is that you have to do what's called develop your pieces. Now, what does this mean? Developing pieces, in the simplest terms, basically means getting them off of their starting squares. So this is developing a piece. This is also developing a piece. One of them is better. And if you understood what I said earlier, you will understand that this is the better move because the knight controls two center squares. If you put the knight out here, you do develop it, but it doesn't control any center space, and it doesn't stop black from doing the same thing. So developing your pieces in the strictest sense is getting them off of their starting squares, because on the starting squares, the pieces have like no power. So let me give you a demonstration. Like, let's say white takes the center, and then black pushes a pawn like this. Then white brings the knight out, developing a piece, and also taking control of some center squares. Let's say black does this. Then you develop a bishop, taking control of more center space. And then black pushes another pawn. You grab the center with this pawn. Black does this. Now you can castle, and then you can bring your rook. You develop your knight, develop your bishop. Like, this is already much better because white's pieces have more potential. They have easier access to black's pawns, and black's pieces aren't doing anything. Like, what's the point of having pieces if you're not going to move them and let them do things? Like, you have to have a mix of pawn moves and piece moves that take control of the center squares and also bring your pieces into the action. So that's the very basic principles of the opening. Like, actually, you could play a semi-decent opening just combining the principles of taking the center and developing your pieces. Like this opening here. I have to play moves for both sides. Like this opening here called the Italian game. Like you can see here, both sides take the center with their pawns like this. Both sides develop their knights. And then both sides develop their bishops, taking control of center squares and eyeing opponents' weak pawns next to their king. I'll talk more about that when we talk about tactics next week. But this is a really great demonstration of combining the principles of taking the center and developing your pieces. And it's actually a mainline opening called the Gioco Piano game. This is where openings derive from. A combination of these strategies, some of them. But that's not all. That is not all of the pieces in the puzzle of opening strategy. There is another aspect to opening strategy, and it has to do with your most important piece. It has to do with your king. Like, not only do you have to develop your pieces and control the center, but you also have to make sure your king is safe. Because if your opponent also develops their pieces and controls the center, their pieces will access your king and put it in danger if you are not careful. So let me just show you what that might look like. So white brings out a piece, controls the center. Black does the same thing. Let's just say we go through this same exact opening that I just showed you, and white castles. Remember this move? Remember castling? Tucks the king away behind pawns, behind a knight. This rook is here. This king is very well protected. But let's say black just instantly like develops this knight. Sure, that's pretty good, right? But then let's say black just leaves their king in the center and just opens up the board like this. It takes control of the center with pawn, hitting the bishop, maybe creating some tension in between the pawns because both the pawns can see each other. This could get a bit dicey for black's king because it's exposed a little bit more. And let's say we have a situation where like the bishop moves back, and then black does this, just bringing a piece off of its starting square. Then we have this pawn take, hitting the knight, so the knight moves. Then we can have like this, like the rook can come and pressure this pawn, which would hit the king because the king is completely exposed. So black needs to be extremely careful. If black leaves their king in the center like this, like they've brought pieces out, they've controlled the center, but if they're just careless, they're just like, oh, I have pieces out and I control the center, their king could be attacked because you left it in the center without protection. Like white's king, it is very hard to make it to white's king, but black's king is under siege because they have not developed it. And it's actually, this particular position is actually really bad for black because if you bring the bishop back because you still want to castle, you will lose it with the move d6. You can't take because that would put the king in check. This is called a pin, and I will talk about it more next week. So that is a rough demonstration of why leaving your king in the middle of the board is really bad, unless it's under specific circumstances where you monitor that your king is safe at all times. Okay, so now you know about the top three principles, in my opinion. You know about developing your pieces, you know about keeping the king safe, and you know about taking the center. And you know that the best opening strategy combines those three principles in a fluid way, right? Like these are how openings are formed. So now, after talking about all of that, I think I should show you something called the golden moves of chess. Taking into account all of the things that I have told you. Let me just open up a new analysis board here. My computer's pretty slow. All right, set up position. We need to make it here so that white can make multiple moves in a row, because this is just going to be a theoretical demonstration of what you should be aiming for in the opening. So we should be aiming for in the opening is, if you can, whoa, that pawn just disappeared. If you can put two pawns in the center of the board, controlling center squares, and then you develop your knights towards the center, controlling center space, developing them. Then you bring your bishops out to eye as many pawns on the black side as you can. Then you castle your king. Then you bring your queen up, and you bring your rooks to the center. Look at this. This is called the golden moves of chess, and as you just saw, the computer evaluation skyrocketed. This position is absolutely killing for white. It's really good for white, because even though both sides have the same amount of material, no side has lost any piece, white's pieces have been developed. White controls the center with both pawns and pieces. White has their rooks positioned, ready to attack pieces if black decides to put them in the center. This is just really good. And white's king is completely safe. This is just very, very, very good for white, because white has combined all of the principles of the opening to achieve what's called the golden moves of chess. But obviously, in a real chess game, right, your opponent won't let you do the golden moves of chess. That is just completely an idealized situation. If you try, you're like, oh, I'm going to put the pawns out in the middle, controlling center space. Black is going to do the same thing. So now, what do you do? What do you do in the opening if your opponent stops you from doing the golden moves? Well, this is where it gets tricky. The opening strategy involves getting your position as close to the ideal moves as possible while denying your opponent the same thing. So, white's best move in this position is this, because you develop a knight and you also attack the pawn in the center of the board, because the knight sees the pawn and it isn't protected by any one of black's pieces. This is a great opening move because it does two things at the same time. It improves your position, and by improve your position, I mean it brings it closer to the golden moves. It develops a piece towards the center, and it makes a threat, which limits black's response. Like, black cannot do their own version of the golden moves as well because they have to respond to this threat. But actually, the best move for black is to develop their own knight while defending the pawn in the center. Again, one move, two purposes. Now, white has a cornucopia of moves that they can do here. They can put another pawn in the center. They can develop the bishop out to any one of these two squares. They can develop the knight. They can push a pawn. White has so many ideas here. But just to demonstrate how a normal game might play out, let's say that you just bring your bishop out here. You develop a bishop to a very nice square, attacking or eyeing that weak pawn, which is only defended by the king, and also stopping black from taking the center with this pawn because two pieces see that square. So now black, knowing that they cannot do this, is going to develop their own piece hitting that pawn. So now white has to react to it. So white can put a knight in the center guarding the pawn. White can push a pawn guarding the pawn, which is actually okay. But just for the purposes of demonstrating the opening strategy and how these concepts interplay, white can do this. Further controlling this square and stopping the knight from taking this. Now black brings their bishop out, eyeing this pawn. So white takes the time to get their king to safety. Black takes the time to get the king to safety. And this is just a very balanced position. And then after this, the game will start to evolve into the middle game. So that's kind of what the classic opening looks like if both players know their chess principles and they try to go towards the ideal moves, but they also make threats. To stop the opponent from doing the same because the opponent has to respond. So let's just say that black changes up the order that they're going to try to get the ideal moves. Let's say that after you play this, black then puts a knight into the center right away. The best move in this position for white is not to develop a piece, but it is to push this pawn and attack the knight that black just put into the center of the board, because you are controlling more space and you are attacking a piece that black put to watch the center and develop, right? And I think this is a great opportunity to talk about what is called tempi, or a tempo. So in order to visualize this, I want you to conceptualize each move in chess as a unit of time. And it is a unit of time that you can use to either improve your position, make your opponent's position worse by making threats that they have to respond to, or ideally to do both at the same time. So this position here, after the opponent plays knight f6, you can win a tempo on black by playing e5, because black cannot put a pawn into the center. Black cannot develop a piece. Black cannot work on getting their king to safety because this knight is under attack. And if black were to give up the knight, that would be 1 point for black and 2 points for white, and white is better after that trade. We will talk about that more in future videos. But the point of this demonstration is demonstrating the concept of tempo. Like, white wins a tempo by this move because black has to respond to it. And then white can continue improving their own position, developing pieces and controlling center space and working towards getting the king safe. Actually, let's say bishop to c4 were played here because this gets a tempo. It's not the best move in this position because black can actually move back and put a threat on that, but it demonstrates the idea pretty well. So the more tempi that you can gain, that's the plural of tempo, is tempi. The more tempi that you gain on your opponent, the more time you have to bring your position closer to the ideal moves, and the more time that black is going to have to spend catching up with you, and you will thus have a better position. It's actually a pretty simple concept. Like when you hear chess players talking about, oh, you attack the knight, that means that you gain a tempo on the knight that black has to respond to, and then you can use that extra time unit to improve your position more. It's actually pretty simple. If you gain several of these tempi throughout a game, they may not seem like much at first, but imagine how they pile up. Like, let's say this, and then you attack it again while taking center space, and then you go here, and then you take more center space. Black develops a knight, then you can attack it. Even though the knight can take this pawn in the center, c5 is still a good move because you gain a tempo. Like, look at these pawns. These pawns are just super powerful. Like, look at the advantage that white can accrue by just simply getting, like, not letting black do what they want. Like, this is what I like to call opponent-focused opening strategy. Like, what I discussed at first, well, like, developing your pieces, controlling the center, and castling, I didn't really discuss what your opponent would be doing because it's better to just conceptualize these things as ideals. Right? Like, you want to do this in a best case scenario. But the reality of chess is an opponent-based strategy. You need to react to what your opponent is doing most of the time. And the best opening strategy combines all of the principles, but also stops your opponent from getting what they want. All right. Sorry, y'all. I got a little bit cut off there. But to finish off this video, I kind of wanted to just give you, because I've talked about how you should play with your pieces and like the general strategy of the opening, but I also wanted to give you two sort of tips about how to play with your pawns, like how to use your pawns in chess, because pawn play is a big part of the opening and the middle game. Your pawns are like very, very important and can be the catalyst for you to seize an advantage or for you to lose. And the first thing that I would like to discuss when it comes to pawns is the fact that, considering that pawns take like this pawn defends this pawn, pawns are best when they are connected and next to each other like this. So, taking that into account, what would happen if, for example, something like this happened? What we have here is what are called doubled pawns. And doubled pawns are just simply when two pawns are on the same file of the board, and for obvious reasons, as I'm sure that you can kind of imagine, they're not as good because they don't support each other, and this pawn cannot move until this pawn moves. So they often just get in each other's way. So normally, doubled pawns are bad. But in this instance, it's kind of a special case because you can go here and then this and reinforce like that, but that's kind of more complicated. I was just trying to teach you. But let me give you an instance where doubled pawns are just terrible. This might take a little bit more setting up, but like let's put a knight here, and then let's say we just get this normal development. Boom, boom. Castles d6, d3 here, and then if white does this, it's not great because then this happens. And what we have here is doubled pawns. And it's like the same thing that was here before, two pawns on top of each other. This one cannot move unless this one does, but this is much worse because whenever a set of pawns gets doubled, you have to keep this in mind, one file on the board becomes semi-open. Like you lose a pawn on one file, and in this case, the file that you lose a pawn from is where your king is. And there's no immediate way for black to attack your king. But in the future, we could get like this. We could get some pawn push. We could get this knight to jump in here. Just if your pawns are doubled like this, you have to always be wary of what is on the file that no longer has a pawn. And if it's your king, it's not really good. So if you get into this instance, you absolutely should not go queen to d2, and instead you should maybe play h3, because now if bishop takes, you don't have to do this, and you can take with the queen, and your king stays protected. The file stays with a pawn on it, and you avoid doubled pawns, and you're actually threatening checkmate. So that the whole plan wasn't too great for black, but if you do take with the pawn, it is bad. And this particular concept, doubled pawns, I'm kind of giving you this as a general rule, but this particular principle has a lot of exceptions, like the one that I showed you at first, where they could support like you taking center space, for example. But a good rule of thumb for beginners is to try to avoid doubled pawns if you can, because sometimes they're quite bad. Okay, and then just one more thing I wanted to say about pawns is how you should optimally use them. Like we've already talked about taking center space, developing your pieces, getting your king to safety. Like you've seen this opening a million times this video. But the way you should play with your pawns, like if your opponent is stopping you from taking the center with 2 pawns, then what you should do is just let's say he goes here, attacking this. Now you could play rook to e1, but the better move is actually d3. Because what this does is it supports the center pawn. It makes the center pawn a lot more powerful. So whenever you can, this structure, like this diagonal line pawn structure, is very good to have, because the pawns here are just very, very well protected and reinforced. So to play with your pawns, if you can't take center space, just connect them, have a very solid structure, and it's going to be really hard for your opponent to upset this. Because at the same time as guarding this against the knight, you reinforce the center, and you also open up this bishop to develop. So this is just a very multi-purpose move. And also, black can do the same thing. Like, this pawn structure is just generally good to have in the opening. But one last thing I want you to be careful of there is, let's say instead of putting the bishop out, you play knight here, and then... Or actually, to demonstrate this better, let's say that you went like here. I know that's a bad move, but I'm just trying to demonstrate this concept better. Your opponent attacks the pawn now. d3 is maybe not the best move in this instance, because what you have done is you have blocked this bishop from actively developing. And now, as you can see, the evaluation likes black's position a little bit better, because this bishop cannot go past this pawn. So you have to be careful. Like, this pawn structure is good, but you have to be careful of blocking in your bishops. You have to make sure that you like develop your bishop first and then do this. That's pretty important. It's a nice rule of thumb. And I think with that, folks, I've given you enough information, and you can go out and practice some opening moves. Maybe you could play a couple practice games. But I will see you next week for the last video in my fundamentals series, where I will be talking about basic tactics. All right, see you next week.